London, January 1661. The winter air bit into the skin, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and burning coal. But the cold wasn't what drew thousands into the streets. They had come for a spectacle, not of justice, but of vengeance. On this day, the past would be exhumed, paraded, and humiliated for all to see. The man at the center of it all had been dead for 2 years, yet his name still carried the weight of rebellion and regicide: Oliver Cromwell. What was about to unfold was more than a grim public display. It was a message, carved into history, by a king who had spent half his life in exile, a man who had seen his father executed and his birthright stolen. Now, the crown was back on his head, and the reckoning had begun. On that cold morning, by direct order of the newly restored monarch, Charles II, Cromwell's corpse was dragged from its grave in Westminster Abbey. At midday, the decaying body was hauled through the streets in a filthy cloth that served as a shroud, jeered at by the crowd until it reached Tyburn, the traditional site of executions. There, the corpse was hung on a gibbet for hours, the mob gorging themselves on the sight. When the display had served its purpose, the body was beheaded, the head impaled on a 6-meter spike and mounted atop Westminster Hall. In a final act of symbolic humiliation, Cromwell's testicles were cut off and shown to the public, the ultimate emasculation of a man who had dared to challenge the crown. His mutilated remains would hang in public view for over 20 years, a rotting warning to anyone tempted to defy royal authority. But how did Charles II, remembered in popular history as the Merry Monarch, lover of women, wine, and the arts, become the architect of such a ruthless display of revenge? To answer that, we must return to the very beginning of his story. Charles Stuart was born on May 29, 1630, the eldest son of King Charles I of England and Queen Henrietta Maria of France. Raised amid the luxury and ceremony of the Stuart court, he was groomed to inherit what he believed was his God-given right, the throne of England. But even in his childhood, the kingdom was on the brink of disaster. His father believed with unshakable certainty in the divine right of kings, the idea that monarchs were chosen by God and answered only to him. That belief brought him into direct conflict with Parliament, whose influence was growing rapidly. Political disputes, religious divisions, and social unrest boiled over into open conflict in 1642, when Charles was just 12 years old. The English Civil War split the nation into 2 camps: the Royalist Cavaliers, who supported the king, and the Parliamentarian Roundheads, who sought to limit his power. The war was brutal, dismantling centuries of tradition and shattering the stability of the monarchy. At just 15, Charles was given command of Royalist forces in Western England, a staggering responsibility for someone so young. But by 1646, the Royalists were defeated, and Charles was forced into exile. From abroad, he witnessed the moment that would shape his life forever. On January 30th, 1649, his father was executed in London after an unprecedented trial for treason against his own kingdom. The young Charles, upon hearing the news, tore his clothes and swore vengeance. At just 18, he proclaimed himself king, though his kingdom existed only in name. The next years were spent wandering the courts of Europe, dependent on the charity of relatives and foreign allies. He slept in borrowed palaces, survived on scarce funds, and endured the humiliation of life as a monarch without a throne. Meanwhile, in England, Oliver Cromwell rose to power as Lord Protector, ruling with the discipline of a military dictator under the guise of a republic. A strict Puritan, Cromwell closed theatres, banned festivities, and enforced a grim moral code. Charles made one bold attempt to reclaim his throne in 1651, leading a Scottish army into England. The campaign ended in disaster at the Battle of Worcester, forcing him into one of the most daring escapes in British history. With a bounty on his head, equivalent to millions today, he spent 6 weeks hiding from Cromwell's soldiers. In one legendary moment, he concealed himself in the branches of an oak tree while enemy troops searched directly beneath him. The royal oak would become an enduring symbol of his resilience. Eventually, Charles escaped to France, disguised as a humble servant. It was a humiliation, but the years in exile hardened him into a different kind of leader. Where his father had been rigid, Charles learned the value of adaptability. He mastered charm, read people with uncanny accuracy, and learned to bend without breaking. But beneath that polished exterior, the fire of vengeance burned hotter than ever. His personal life in exile was the stuff of scandal, lovers, lavish parties, and extravagance that shocked even the permissive French aristocracy. But behind the libertine facade was a calculating mind that never lost sight of his ultimate goal, the restoration of the Stuart monarchy. That chance came in 1658, when Oliver Cromwell died. His son, Richard Cromwell, lacked his father's skill and authority, and within 2 years, the fragile Commonwealth was falling apart. Factions fought for power, the army mutinied, and the country teetered on the brink of chaos. Seizing the moment, General George Monk, commander of English forces in Scotland, marched into London. He forced the calling of a new parliament, one that recognized the inevitability of restoring the monarchy to avoid further bloodshed. In secret, they began negotiations with the exiled Charles. The tide was finally turning, and the man who had waited half his life in exile was about to return, not just as king, but as the avenger of a dynasty. In April of 1660, Charles issued what became known as the Declaration of Breda, a masterstroke of political maneuvering. It promised amnesty to his former enemies, religious tolerance, back pay for the army, and a pledge that land disputes would be resolved by Parliament. Every faction saw something in it for themselves, yet Charles had managed to offer all of this without sacrificing any of his future power. Then came May 29th, 1660, his 30th birthday. On that day, Charles returned to London in triumph. The city erupted in celebration. One eyewitness claimed the streets were so full that it seemed they were paved with people. Another wrote that the king was nearly crushed beneath the sheer weight of public affection. After years of civil war, failed Republican experiments, and the harsh austerity of Puritan rule, the people welcomed back the merry monarch as a promise of stability and joy. But behind that charming smile, behind those words of reconciliation, Charles harbored a much darker intention. The leniency of the Declaration of Breda had been calculated. It was a means to secure a smooth return to power. Once the throne was firmly his, the true scale of his vengeance became apparent. His first targets were obvious: the regicides, those men who had signed his father's death warrant. Despite the vague promises of amnesty, Charles made it very clear that no mercy would be shown to those directly responsible for what he saw as the murder of a martyr king. Out of the 59 who had signed the warrant, many were already dead or had fled abroad, but of those who remained, 30 were condemned to die. 10 were executed publicly, not simply killed, but subjected to the full traitor's punishment. They were hanged, cut down while still alive, their entrails ripped out and burned before their eyes, and finally beheaded. These grim public spectacles drew massive crowds, eager to witness the brutal fate of men who had dared to raise a hand against their sovereign. The most shocking revenge, however, was reserved for the dead. Oliver Cromwell, his son-in-law Henry Ireton, and John Bradshaw, the judge who had presided over Charles III's trial, were all long buried, but their graves did not protect them. On January 30th, 1661, the anniversary of Charles III's execution, their bodies were dug up and subjected to a grotesque posthumous execution. Cromwell's genital mutilation was a symbolic act, an attempt to strip away the power that had once dared to overthrow the monarchy. It revealed the depth of Charles's humiliation during his years in exile. Death alone was not enough for these enemies. Their corpses had to be degraded, their dignity erased, their remains displayed as a warning to the generations that followed. Cromwell's severed head remained on a spike above Westminster Hall for nearly a quarter of a century, until a storm finally brought it down. From there, it vanished into the hands of private collectors, shrouded in morbid fascination, until it was quietly buried in the 20th century at Cambridge's Sidney Sussex College in a secret ceremony. As his vengeance played out, Charles moved swiftly to consolidate his power. The Cavalier Parliament, elected in 1661, was packed with staunch royalists eager to restore the authority of the crown. The Clarendon Code soon followed, re-establishing the dominance of the Anglican Church and cracking down hard on dissenters, particularly the Puritans who had once stood behind Cromwell. But Charles's restoration was more than just political, it was personal. Publicly, he cultivated the image of a ruler who embraced pleasure. The theatres, long closed under Puritan rule, reopened. Festivals returned. His court became infamous for its extravagance and decadence. Yet behind this facade was a man who worked tirelessly and thought strategically, never forgetting the lessons he had learned during exile. Where his father, Charles I, had been formal and distant, Charles II strolled casually through St. James's Park, often with nothing more than his beloved spaniels for company, dogs that still bear his name today. Where his father had been reserved, he flaunted his affairs, openly keeping mistresses and acknowledging 14 illegitimate children with women from all walks of life, from actresses and courtesans to an orange seller who became a royal favorite. To some, it looked like frivolity. In truth, it was calculated. Charles knew that survival meant walking a fine line, balancing rival factions while gradually strengthening the monarchy. He often told his advisors, "I do not intend to go on my travels again," a sharp reminder that he would never allow himself to be driven into exile a second time. The challenges ahead were enormous, but Charles II had returned determined not just to restore the monarchy, but to reshape it in his own image. The Great Plague of 1665 claimed nearly a quarter of London's population. Just a year later, the Great Fire of 1666 swept through the city, reducing much of the capital to ash. In the face of both disasters, Charles II chose to remain in London during the plague and personally oversee firefighting efforts during the blaze. These actions bolstered his popularity, casting him as a king who, unlike his father, truly cared for his people. But nothing would test his grip on the throne more than the growing wave of anti-Catholic paranoia. His brother, James, Duke of York, had converted to Catholicism. Charles himself, who would secretly convert on his deathbed, was long suspected of harboring Catholic sympathies. In 1678, the infamous Popish plot, a fabricated Catholic conspiracy to assassinate the king, plunged the nation into hysteria. Public fear demanded blood, and Charles responded with political calculation, allowing the execution of innocent Catholics to appease the mob while quietly shielding others, including his brother. In 1681, Parliament sought to exclude the Catholic Duke of York from the line of succession. Charles countered with shrewd political maneuvering, dissolving 3 successive parliaments and invoking royal prerogative to bypass his opponents. He crushed the Exclusion Bill and emerged stronger than ever, ruling without Parliament for the rest of his reign. His coffers filled by secret subsidies from France's King Louis XIV. The price was a pro-French foreign policy and quiet tolerance of Catholics, concessions Charles was willing to make to preserve his independence at home. His reign was a study in contradictions. Publicly, he staged grand celebrations and displayed acts of mercy. Privately, he could be calculating and vengeful. He ordered brutal executions, yet impressed contemporaries like John Evelyn, who described him as possessing a gentle and familiar nature, unlike any prince before him. The Restoration was not just about returning the monarchy. It was also about restoring Charles's own dignity after years of humiliation. He had witnessed his father's execution, lived on foreign charity, hidden from pursuers, and disguised himself as a servant. Those scars ran deep, and his vengeance against Cromwell and the regicides showed just how deep. It went beyond executions. Cromwell's legacy was dismantled piece by piece, Republican institutions abolished, royal ceremony restored, even architecture like Whitehall Palace and Windsor Castle rebuilt to proclaim the majesty of kingship and erase the memory of Puritan austerity. Charles became a political symbol in his own right. Where Cromwell had worn plain armor, Charles projected royal grandeur. Standing over 6 feet tall, with dark features that earned him the nickname Black Boy, and adorned with elaborate wigs, he cut an imposing figure. Portraits by Sir Peter Lely depicted him in classical armor or rich robes, embodying the divine authority for which his father had died. Even in his final years, despite declining health, Charles rose at 5 a.m. to deal with state affairs before court life began. He had a genuine interest in science, founding the Royal Observatory at Greenwich and supporting the Royal Society. As the Earl of Halifax once said, his easy, pleasant nature might have led him into errors, but it also softened their consequences. In February 1685, illness, likely uremia, struck suddenly. After nearly a week of suffering, Charles II died. In those final hours, he revealed his ultimate secret. The defender of Anglicanism had converted to Catholicism, receiving last rites from a hidden priest. It was a fittingly paradoxical end to a reign full of contradictions. This was a king who could order executions and yet commute death sentences, who persecuted Puritans yet quietly championed religious tolerance, whose libertine court scandalized moralists, yet who worked tirelessly to rebuild his nation. His last words to his brother included a plea, "Let not poor Nellie starve," referring to his beloved mistress, Nell Gwyn. Even in death, his thoughts turned to those close to him. Yet on his tomb, in Westminster Abbey, there is no mention of his darkest acts, no reference to the gruesome vengeance he exacted on Cromwell's remains. The official memory celebrates the merry monarch who brought stability after decades of chaos, rebuilt London, and nurtured the arts and sciences. But beneath that image lies a more complex truth. Charles was shaped by trauma and humiliation, and his revenge, executing regicides and desecrating corpses, was a symbolic act meant to purge the monarchy's shame. By publicly mutilating Cromwell's body, he sent a clear message. Royal power was back, and it was untouchable. In the end, Charles II achieved what his father could not. He not only survived, but reshaped the monarchy into something that could endure in an age of parliamentary power. His vengeance was not just personal, it was institutional. The last blow in a long civil conflict and the final rejection of the Republican dream. What emerged was neither the absolute autocracy of Charles III nor Cromwell's republic, but the foundations of a constitutional monarchy that, in altered form, still exists today. The man who ordered his enemy's corpse mutilated was also the man who charmed his court, who built observatories, who laughed and loved. A ruler of contradictions, whose legacy remains as complex as the age he helped to define.